The Process, a podcast about creativity and experimental music. In the world of experimental music, outcomes and accolades for creators can be uncertain and at times seem far and few between. Therefore, creators and practitioners of experimental music must embrace the one thing they will always have complete control over: the process. This podcast aims to understand this creative process by listening to new works and discussing them with their creators. Each episode focuses on one creator and their music. Understanding how and why they create can inform aspiring creatives and help audiences better understand and navigate experimental music. I'm Dr. Doug Bielmeyer, and I'll be your host as we explore the world of experimental music, creativity, and the human need to find purpose in their world and lives. This is The Process.
The fact that we had to suddenly be within a refined area meant that I had to listen.
Yeah.
And I was shocked by the roads going quiet where we live.
Right. And the
We live by a
birds.
really busy main road, but we're in a very rural area, but the road takes over a lot of the sound, I suppose. And
Yeah.
now no one's on that road, the sounds of nature were amplified, and that was like a really inspirational and very moving,
Right.
surprising kind of thing that happened. And like I was kind of had lots of room to create music. You know, I had I balanced a job with my music creation, and that suddenly stopped. And although I have a family, and it did mean I had more time. And so I knew that I was going to create music, and I'd already created music sort of loosely associated with landscape, and that kind of brought that into focus and led to me recording sounds from the landscape to directly kind of influence musical decisions and constructions within my composition.
Yeah.
So yeah,
It was such a ghostly time because the soundscape of just our neighborhoods and places changed.
Right.
And definitely the first thing I noticed was sort of like you were saying, the the traffic from the road or the nearby interstate, that went down. But I noticed then animal sounds, birds, other things, just sort of the natural occurrences that normally we can't hear because they're just washed out by all our sort of, noise pollution.
Yeah.
So you heard these sounds, and for me, I remember during the time I just started like videotaping everything. I think with my phone,
Wow.
the silence, like just the,
Yeah.
I was
Brilliant.
using video to record the sounds. But
Yeah.
you said you went out and did some recording as well. So did you just take a microphone or a Zoom recorder and
Yeah,
do
I
some
mean, like
recording?
we were quite restricted here in the UK, so we couldn't really like. There were points. I don't know what it's like in the States,
Yeah,
but
yeah.
there were points in the UK where we weren't allowed to even walk within a couple of miles of our home.
Right. Right.
So we were restricted almost to our own spaces, and we'd moved house out of a rental property into a
Mhm.
bought house, which
Yeah.
fortunately for us was actually more rural
Yeah.
than our last place, and meant that
Have a little more
the
space.
soundscape was much more natural anyway, and that was kind of like a desire, something
Yes.
I loved.
Yes. Yeah.
But I just think there are things like the minutiae that I
Mhm.
wouldn't have heard before that mattered. So the sound of bees
Hmm.
on small ground-dwelling flowers that I
Yeah.
perhaps wouldn't have even noticed the pollen being
Right.
taken from a small flower that was growing up in the crack of a pavement.
Yeah.
Those things wouldn't have been heard. The bird song would have been other things, but that really had an impact to me. And I wrote a tune called "The Sweetness of the Morning" with those recordings in,
Mhm.
which were just outside the kind of patio doors of my studio at the time.
Mhm.
And I think that kind of gave birth to a real interest in a local landscape not too far away, which was the subsequent album after that called Mind.
Mhm.
And then this new project is an extension of that, really.
Mhm. Mhm. So it's some recording, some sort of like field recording, as we might say, and then are you plugging it into a DAW or a computer and just manipulating the hell out of it, or do you take a more sort of hands-off approach?
Sure.
What's your strategy?
I think probably like I'm a bit of a purist in that sense at the moment, anyway.
Sure.
And I on the Mind album, there's a landscape here that just feels really special to me, and we lived away from where we live now for a decade, near the big city,
Sure.
near London, and there was something missing. And I think the thing that was missing was the familiarity of where we are from, which didn't seem to matter in your late teens and early 20s.
Right.
And that's the thing that you want to throw away and move away from. But
Right.
when we were away from it, it always felt like something was missing. And then when we came back, it was like, oh, wow, it's like the landscape where we belong, which is the thing that I think I've been longing for. And in that landscape, in those familiar hills, was where I wanted to kind of put all my musical creativity and projects into. And so I fast forward to the Mind album. I had a residency with a massive charity here called the National Trust that kind of look after a lot of our landscapes and paths and stuff, and they have rooms and tea rooms and things like that. So I was able to move my studio post-COVID or in between lockdowns into one of those places and take field recordings, as you were saying, from the landscape to directly inspire melody. And so the field recordings were unaffected, but they were like the sort of starting point every time for how do I write a piece of music that's authentically about this place, and kind of portrays what it is. And that was that album. So that's very much undoctored kind of field recordings. But I also tapped into biodata, which is putting electrodes onto leaves and plants and that kind of world. And the knowledge of that world was coming into my view, I suppose. And so that featured on the album, and that was beautiful. And I suppose that's quite a human thing in the sense that, conductivity in the leaves of plants is translated into MIDI, and generates notes. So there's like
on and off information. So
right.
Yeah.
But there's something mysterious and beautiful about it too, and magical and unpredictable, and that featured widely on the album. And then I suppose you may be asking about Anthropocene, and fast forward to Anthropocene, and that kind of that's the backdrop for where I'm at now with this release.
So field recordings, but then also just taking like a piezo electric sort of, impulse or contact microphones from the actual plants to get some other data to further manipulate. it sounds like it's just much more than just, sticking a microphone up in the backyard and getting the sound of birds. One
Yeah.
thing that I thought was really kind of a beautiful thing, and it kind of took me aback, is we often think about, like, you talked about this idea of like the place we're from. And especially personally, I've moved around the United States to all different places. And
Oh, yeah.
yeah, I always talk about like the food and the people and like
Yes.
all the traffic or the noise or whatever. Those are the things. But I often, and it's so bizarre, but I just didn't even think about the soundscape, and that maybe the birds and the different things that I hear now back in the Northeast of the United States
Right.
reminds me of, the first 20 years of my life. Absolutely.
Yeah, and I think it's a really interesting thing, isn't it?
Hmm.
Like if you're kind of middle-aged or heading that way,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
the things that you're young and you reject health, and it's a really healthy thing. I
Right,
really believe that that's there for a reason, and
right,
you want to get away from home.
right. Yeah.
And those kind of, like, I'm from a rural place which isn't that
Mhm,
exciting.
mhm.
It's beautiful. Well, it is actually becoming that way,
Right,
but certainly when we were growing up, it wasn't. And
right. When you're in your
and
20s,
travel
it's like,
wasn't
I need to
common.
move to the big city. Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, and get away. Yeah,
yeah. There aren't
mhm,
many people your age around,
yeah. Hmm.
but there's something really informing that I didn't realize about, and maybe it's only for certain people, but the kind of visual map of the ridge lines and the way that a hill rises and falls
Yeah, yeah,
just really matters. I don't know why. And when we
yeah.
came back, and it kind of thought, well, I think that was the thing that was missing. so Anthropocene is a tune that I'd actually been gigging for about 3 years, and slotting it into sort of my live sets alongside material from Mind and my previous albums. And I guess I tried to lay the track down. It's a term, by the way, if you haven't heard the term Anthropocene, it was a term that was banding around a few years back on trying to define the current epoch that we're in.
Sure.
Which seems like, and these kind of ecological issues and things are very new to me. You know, it's not that I've always been massively interested in them myself, other than that I've liked walking, being outside. But as I kind of, it really piques my interest now, and certainly has been a developmental thing in my own practice as an artist. But the Anthropocene really appealed to me because it was this, not necessarily the categorization of the term Anthropocene, but the fact that it couldn't be agreed upon, and it still hasn't been agreed upon. Right. Like the date at which we should pin down the idea that mankind has had an impact on the climate, on planet Earth. And so every other epoch it isn't denoted by mankind, and yet this terminology, Anthropocene, I think scientists agree is the correct terminology for the epoch that we're in. It's just that they can't decide on when that is, and so there's still a debate going on.
Sure. When did it actually begin? When did it begin, and what stage of it are we in? Right.
And it's of course it's really complicated because it probably isn't. You can't define it by a year or a date, maybe. You know. And even therein, there's debate about species being discovered all the time, new species, versus species that are being lost, and versus kind of discussions about whether, you know, the extremity of climate change, and all of the kind of voices therein.
Right.
But like,
yes.
you know, it's like a really complicated project, kind of idea, and so the actual track itself isn't a hammer for climate change, for sure. But it is a very, from a personal point of view of where we live, it is kind of biographical. In the sense that we see the change and the story about some of the bird life here that's disappeared almost completely, and the kind of high water content that we're experiencing in the county and in the nation, in our rivers and streams. You know, it kind of like lends itself very well to these ideas that are highlighted by the Anthropocene.
And it affects all those little changes affect everything in the ecosystem, and then, you know, different birds, no birds, other birds. So one of the things that's interesting about the form of the piece, like if we just like look at it, we'll get into, you know, there's some saxophone, there's some other things going on this track. But if we look at just like the general form of the piece, it does have this, you know, it begins with what I would refer to as just a field recording. It sounds like, you know, a very basic sort of soundscape. And then this is in the most base terms here. I'm looking at the form over this 10 minutes of sort of, you know, the earth sounds, music, you know, quotes. There's this real pulse that happens. And then as the piece kind of comes to the end, or this first A part of the suite, there's a lot of distortion, and sort of it seems like what we're hearing originally has now been sort of altered in some way.
Yeah, and like in many ways, that's very simple in its structure. You know, we begin with a theme or an idea that things are undisturbed from an ecological point of view, and then we introduce the human.
Music,
which perhaps the piano, you know, and so I deliberately had a very long intro, and I've recorded some birdsong in some of the valleys, and I'm really interested in tape loop and working with tape and cassettes, and that whole world of going back to analog is really fascinating and very slow, and I think that's why I really like it. It's very cathartic, and it seems to take ages to get great results, which is quite a beautiful process. You know, months of experimenting with sounds. And so, like with the birdsong that I recorded, I kind of arrived at exploring tape loops with the bird song, and it kind of made sense. This stuck kind of bird song, which kind of recycles and goes back and gets stuck with kind of what we felt that we were experiencing, and what we're experiencing globally and locally. So the bird songs begins in its full length, the field recording, and then goes into a tape loop, which over time is decaying, and I'm still performing with the same tape loop, but it's actually changing every gig.
So even so 10 years from now, if you're still playing the same set, it might be obliterated by that point. You're saying it's
absolutely. I did a recording with it recently. Actually, I was playing with it, and it sounds awful. But, in itself, that's like a fascinating idea.
It is,
like how fascinating that's like on a plastic kind of thing that's been human made with a tape. Anyway, those are all amazing things. So that's in there.
It's so corporeal, which in a digital age, it's like we can do the same thing over and over and over again. No loss of quality. And so to have something that you limited use, limited resource,
and how like amazing that I stumbled across the two things at the same time. I like it, but it also sits very comfortably with me. The use of these kind of devices and like how anyway. So the intro features that, but it also features a very beautiful idea of kind of a slow evolving drone. This kind of harmony, I suppose, if you like it. And then when the piece, as you rightly said, there's a pulse that kicks in, then we're kind of entering into the beauty and chaos of humanity, the symbiosis between the human and planet Earth, So, and that begins to kind of peak and distort at times. And then you're right. At the end, there's a kind of little bit of a friction there where things have fallen out, really, and there's distortion, but there's a little bit of beauty in there. Yeah, it's a really hard thing to agree with, the fact that you want to or not want to do a radio edit or not. I think probably I'm a massive fan of radio, and I have so much respect for radio. I've been supported by radio here in the UK and in the US actually so well, and so I suppose it's a kind of hats off to the producers who are producing programs, and a kind of and a thank you to them, and an acknowledgement that it's a nightmare.
Yeah, right.
If I'm producing tracks in kind of the region of 10-20 minutes, it's maybe they will be played
Sure.
in their entirety, but I get the difficulty of programming. I'm an avid listener of BBC Radio 3, BBC Radio 3's night tracks and unclassified programs here in the UK, and I think probably I was hyper aware that I could write music that's very long form. So Anthropocene could have been 22 minutes, could have been 18, could have been whatever, but actually there's something about decision making that's extremely creative when you have to put something down. It was really interesting. I actually tried to edit the second track for a long time, so Anthropocene was never going to be shorter, because it felt like it was
it is the length it was, like you just can't change it. No
one can mess with it,
right. It's
this mantra. And I tried and tried. Sorry, I tried to edit above, below, down, and it sounded just didn't work. And with Anthropocene, it just works so well. And I'm a massive fan of the mixing phase. I really love that kind of arrangement part of my music creation an awful lot. It's so satisfying, and so like even if it never made it to the radio edit, I would have loved the process of doing it, and even if it arrived at a bum conclusion, I don't want this to be ever released, it sounds awful, it would still would have been so fun to kind of cut that thing out and see. It's kind of like a little lesson, what in the track kind of works and what doesn't, what's interesting, what isn't, what's just me indulging. And what really makes sense, what needs to be said.
Well, fantastic. This Joel, this has been wonderful speaking to you about the new, we'll say, EP bridge between albums. Just how about pieces of art here that we can listen to. Before I let you go, though, tell us a little bit about where we could go to listen to this, download it, find out more about it, and you and your music.
Sure. Oh, thank you, Doug. It's been brilliant to chat about my music with you. Absolutely. Thank you so much. And the Anthropocene is obviously available on all digital streaming platforms, but it's possibly worth noting that on Bandcamp, there is both tracks that Bandcamp released. There's a live performance, a recorded live performance of Anthropocene here in Shrewsbury, in the Unitarian Church, which is actually, ironically, Charles Darwin's boyhood church that he went to. So, that's an interesting kind of connection. Full circle, if you will.
Right. Thanks to Joel, aka Tiny Leaves, for sharing his time and music with us. If you enjoyed this episode, please check out other episodes in the series, and as always, like, subscribe, or leave a comment in your preferred podcasting app. This is sadly the last episode of Season 5, but don't worry, Season 6 will be back in full strength in 2025. Until then, hang in there, stay strong, and keep listening. I'm Dr. Doug Bielmeyer, and this has been The Process.